Welcome back to Soteriology 101. As you can see on the screen, we have a guest with us today. This is John Cranman. Many of you may have been aware who follow us on Facebook that John had a debate recently with the esteemed Dr. James White, a well-known apologist, who I've debated before on the same topic of Romans chapter 9. And so we have some things in common. Welcome, John, to the program.
Hey, Leighton.
I appreciate you taking some time in your afternoon, or actually early morning here, I guess. And I know you got kids still running around the house and all kinds of fun stuff, but I appreciate you stopping in and joining me on this program.
For sure.
What I wanted to do is kind of talk through the Romans 9 debate that you had with, really wasn't much of a debate, obviously, because it's not a live situation. You've got commercial breaks with Justin on the Unbelievable program. And all that. It's more of a discussion back and forth, and not a lot of cross-examination things happening. But at the same time, I wanted to get your feedback, and then I wanted to give you some of my feedback. I think you did a really good job, especially for your first kind of discussion with a seasoned apologist. And I think you held your own. I think you asked the right questions. I think you pressed on the right points of contention. And so all those things were good, and that's some of the things I really want to discuss in this program is some of those points of contention and really dive deeper into that, because I think there's a particular question you asked and you kept trying to get back to that was never really addressed, at least in a way that we would find satisfying. And that's what I want to get to. So tell us, what were your thoughts about the debate afterwards? Kind of what were your what did you process after you got done with it?
I'm just glad I survived it, to be honest. I wasn't sure what I was going to find in the debate or what I was going to walk into, but I felt kind of what you said earlier, just about I felt like my argument was pretty simple. I just had those two main contentions. You know, I thought in Romans 9 that verse 14, everything hinges on that, and I thought it was a Jewish objection rather than a synergist. I felt that wasn't really replied to, and my other contention was more of an offensive against his position, where how do we even know, if as Dr. White admits, that Paul isn't even bringing up the salvation of these individuals, how do we even know that his point is about individual salvation or unconditional individual election to salvation? And I felt that just really wasn't answered, in the way that I kept pressing him on.
Right.
He answered it, but I don't think it was a sufficient answer.
Right.
So,
and to kind of catch people up, those that may be just tuning into this portion of it, we'll back up a little bit and let me explain a little bit of the context, and John, jump in as you feel needed. But the main contention that we have with those who hold to a Calvinistic approach to Romans 9, and by the way, there are various types of approaches from different Calvinists on Romans 9. So we're specifically talking about James White's approach, especially as it relates to his book, The Potter's Freedom, which is what we were contending with, and what I contended with him in my debate, as well as in my book, The Potter's Promise. And so it really gets down to the assumption, and I think it is an assumption on the Calvinist part. Obviously, that's the debatable portion of it. A presumption that's brought to the text that says when Paul is talking about God's choice of Jacob over Esau or Isaac over Ishmael, that he is talking about unconditional election to, I would even add, effectual salvation. So because that's the Calvinistic system, it's unconditional election, meaning I chose Jacob, not Esau, for salvation, that they would be changed in some regenerative way, that some irresistible thing would change them at some point in life and make them be faithful followers of God, that would change their nature to make them want to follow God. And he didn't do that with the brother.
Hold on one second.
All right. Yeah, I know you have kids there, so that's okay. No worries. We can always pause it whenever you get the interruptions. So I'm a dad. I have 4 kids. I've been there. So when we're talking about election, what are we talking about election to? Because we all believe in election. We believe that this is about election. We believe it's soteriological. We believe it's about the people's salvation. And James White's presumption is that it's about individuals being chosen before the foundation of the world for reasons unknown to us for effectual salvation. So Jacob was chosen for that. But the contention that you brought up by quoting from my debate was to show that in the original context, God's choice of Jacob over Esau and Isaac over his brothers was not necessarily for their salvation. It was about who the promise would come through. And even James White admits that. So you're pushing him by saying, okay, if the original context doesn't mean that, then how do you presume that Paul is meaning that when he's quoting from those Old Testament texts? Is that a pretty fair assessment of what you were really trying to push him on? And we can get those quotes in here in a minute, but I'm just trying to kind of give a layout of the layout of the land, so to speak, of what you're really trying to contend with him on. Does that summarize it pretty well?
Yes, 100%. That's basically, so how are we making this, how are we inferring that's what Paul's point is? You know, if we're talking about, if Paul's not even mentioning the salvation of the individuals he brings up, how are we inferring that he's making a point about individual election salvation? And I'm kind of, I think it would be easier if Paul just came out and said that, or if you went to that, the original context and that's what you see. But the fact that that's so ambiguous, it's not even there. And even as Dr. White admits, it's not even in view. It's outside of the scope of Romans 9. So it's just kind of like it cuts the floor out from under the Calvinists. So now we have to kind of rebuild the case. Okay, so where are we drawing this from? Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to press him on.
Matter of fact, let's play a little clip. I've got a little clip, about 30-second clip here, of James White in a debate with another non-Calvinist. And he says it even more clearly in that debate as to his contention with regard to reference to the Old Testament. Let's listen to that.
Yep.
That the greater will serve the lesser, just as has been written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. So you have two quotations from Genesis 25. One from Genesis 25, one from Malachi chapter 1. And it's the apostle who must give us the interpretation of his use of these texts. He gives us his own apostolic interpretation. We can't run off to the original text and say, well, it can only mean this. No, it's going to mean exactly what the apostle Paul applies it to mean. And so what does he mean when he says in verse 13, just as has been written, Jacob I love, but Esau hated?
Okay, so there we have the clip. So let me pull you back in here. So when you first hear, what do you think of when you first hear that? First of all, John, I'll get your commentary before I comment.
It's pretty much, he's just echoing the same exact thing he told you in the debate you had with him. And to me, it's really startling and surprising. Another thing is it just, like I said in the debate, it just kind of begs the question. I think what he equivocates between, quote unquote, the apostolic interpretation with what he thinks Paul is trying to get at, which is the Calvinist interpretation. And that's what's in question. We're trying to establish that. So as he did in our debate, I believe he begged the question. He did it in this debate you played the recording of.
Right. So what he calls,
we're trying to figure out what the apostle means.
Yeah. You can't call the Calvinistic interpretation the apostolic interpretation without just begging the question. In other words, for those that don't know debate fallacies, begging the question is when you assume true the question up for debate. So the question is, what is the apostolic interpretation? In other words, what is Paul quoting the Old Testament verses for? What's he trying to accomplish? And according to James White, is you can't run off, as he put it, you can't run off to the Old Testament context and find out what it meant then. Instead, you've got to go just to Paul, and you've got to go straight to what he's saying. And it's obvious, at least in James White's mind, that Paul means to interpret the Old Testament text in a Calvinistic way. And what you're asking, and what I was attempting to ask in the first debate, is how do you know that? Do you just read Paul's mind? Is there something that Paul says that clearly indicates that he has now shifted from the Old Testament meaning of election to a newfound theology that's never been established in any other page of Scripture, and he's just all of a sudden saying, okay, the apostolic interpretation of what I chose, my choice of Jacob and my choice of Isaac before him, is individual election to salvation. Is that what's happening here? And so before we even go there, let's just establish what election is, okay? And I think that even Calvinists would agree with us that God elected the nation of Israel, right? I think all of us would agree with that. And so just putting it here on the screen, the very first promise that God makes to Abram before he's even Abraham, this is the promise. This is kind of what the reference back to the promise of God to the nation of Israel, the seed of Abram. Okay, so the Lord says to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, which, by the way, that's a conditional promise. Notice it says there, I'll bless you, and whoever curses you, I will also curse. So if the Edomites curse you, like Malachi's passage, if the Edomites curse you, then I will curse them. They will have...
Or Pharaoh.
Right, or Pharaoh curses you, or whoever curses you, I will curse. So that's a conditional promise. It's not an unconditional thing I've just, arbitrarily decided it's going to happen to people who curse the people of God. And all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. And most scholars would agree, most exegetes would agree that this is a reference to the fact that the law, the prophets, the apostles, and the Messiah all come through this nation, the nation of Israel, which is exactly what Romans chapter 9, verse 4 and 5 discuss, that the promises are given to these people, the Messiah comes through these people. They are elect of God. They are the chosen. Matter of fact, in New Testament vernacular, the nickname for the Jew is to be called the elect lady. It's talking about the chosen lady because she is of the nation of Israel, and they were the elect nation. They were the chosen people. So in the Old Testament context that Paul quotes from, and he quotes several times throughout the chapter 9 of Romans, he quotes from the Old Testament several times. And he's referencing, obviously, back to his choice of Isaac, his choice of Jacob, his choice to bless these people, and he is doing that for a purpose. So we believe election is in view. And what drives me crazy, if you haven't noticed, is when Calvinists, like James White, accuse us of not believing this is about election, or that it's not soteriological. I mean, you started in your opening saying, I believe this is soteriological. I started in my opening saying, I believe this is soteriological. It is, yep. And another thing that drives me nuts, when they think that it's not about individuals, like individuals aren't involved here. Like, no, Jacob's an individual. Pharaoh is an individual. Individuals are involved here. The question is...
I agree. Just to interject, soteriological or soteriology is such an umbrella term. It could mean just many different things. Just because it's soteriological doesn't mean it's the kind of soteriology where God elects individuals to salvation. It could just be what I believe it's just talking about the reason why the Jews aren't coming to the gospel, why they aren't being saved. And that's the sense of soteriology that I see in Romans 9. Right. So that's just an umbrella term. You have to fill in the blanks of what kind of soteriology Paul is getting at here. And we can't just assume it's the kind that James White thinks it is, as well as, like, and you've said this before, Leighton, these words like election, these words are packed with so much. There's all these presuppositions we bring to the table in this word election. And, Calvinists, when they hear that word, they have a completely different meaning than what I think is warranted, or it's really a neutral word. It just means a choice. Right. Chosen people. It doesn't mean how they're chosen. That's being kind of assumed or being smuggled in by the Calvinists. So.
Right. So we agree Jacob was chosen over Esau, right? You would agree with that?
Absolutely.
Right. So that means...
The individual.
Right. And he's an individual, and he was chosen over his brother. That means, therefore, in some people's mind, so you're a Calvinist because you think Jacob was chosen to be effectually changed and made into a believer, and Esau was left in his own rebellious condition from birth where he would only hate God and reject God, and therefore you're a Calvinist because you just admitted God elected Jacob and not Esau. And you're going, no, because I don't have, I don't believe any of those presuppositions. I believe
not at all.
I believe God chose Jacob to be the lineage through which the Messiah and his prophets would come.
Not even just that. Dr. White admits that wasn't even the choice. He admits it wasn't. That none of that was even in view. So, If somebody on the Calvinist side is admitting that, then it's kind of like, okay, we still have to figure out, well, where are we getting this from?
Right. Where are you?
That's really interesting.
Is it just presumed because you're a Calvinist, or is there something else in the passage that clearly states this is its intention? And of course, we're going to hear from White here in a second. We'll read his exact answers, and because I really want to be fair to him, we're using exact quotes from him, and I want to be fair to him because I really want you to understand what the Calvinist is arguing here, because I want you to understand why we reject what the Calvinist is arguing. So I don't want to misrepresent what White says, and we're going to look at the exact quotes. But before we get there, look at this side by side, okay? So on provisionism, or some forms of Arminianism, you might say, or traditionalism, whatever ism you want to put on there, I don't really care about the label. What I think John and I would both agree, and John, correct me if this is not what you would say as well, but it's God's right to choose how to define his covenant people. In other words, how would you unpack that? They've heard enough from me. You unpack what you think that means. It's God's right to choose how to define his people.
Right. I think what's going on, the choices that are going on in Romans 9 is that. It's God's right he's defining who his covenant people are. Because the question is what if this promise is for the Jews, then what happened to it? Like, why aren't they receiving the promise? Why aren't they coming to the God? Why aren't they believing the gospel? And so Paul is just sketching out who this promise is for, and God's right to define who these people are that are eligible for this promise. And basically his whole point is that God gets to define this. It's not through works. It's not through ethnicity. It's not through any of these things that the Jews at this time thought guaranteed them a right to receive this promise.
Wait a second. Wait a second, Apostle Paul. Let me be the objector here, okay? Wait a second. I am a natural-born citizen of Abraham. I am a child of Israel. And you're trying to tell me that God can define his covenant people, and he can choose to save that prostitute on the street corner just because she believes in this Jesus person? And I'm working my butt off to make sure I'm running and I'm striving and I am working to make sure I keep all of these 60 some odd laws meticulously. And I am a child of, and she is a barbarian. Matter of fact, I think she's a Samaritan. She's a half-breed. I mean, she is obviously not elect. She is an enemy of God. And you're trying to tell me that God can choose to make her a part of the covenant people? That's not fair. Is that a fair representation of the objector in Paul's mind?
Yes, I believe that's definitely part of it. And Paul's answer to that is, well, let's take your Bible, let's take your scriptures, and I'll show you where God has done this. And he goes back to Genesis. He goes back to Isaac and Ishmael. And Ishmael has that same right. He could make that same objection. Abraham's my father. I'm from the line, I'm of the same ethnicity, but God rejects that. He that's not enough. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity is.
The Edomites could say that.
Genesis 25.
The Edomites could say that better than anybody. The Edomites could say, not only are we a child of Abraham, we're a child of the oldest son of Isaac. I mean, if anybody had birthright claims, it would be the Edomites. But if they cursed him, if they cursed the seed, they too would be cursed. And so Paul is using them as an example to say, look, just because you're a natural descendant of this seed does not guarantee that you're a part of the covenant people of God, because it's not by works, it's by faith. And this is the biggest thing I try to emphasize in my debate, by pointing to Paul's own commentary in verse 30 and following, which, by the way, James White never got to in his opener. People say he did exegete the entire thing of Romans 9. No, he didn't. He didn't get past verse 26. In verse 30, he says, what shall we say to these things? And he gives his own commentary. And what's his commentary? Israel's trying to pursue it through running and working through the law, and they're not attaining righteousness. But the Gentiles, the barbarian Gentiles, the Samaritans, the half-breeds, they're pursuing it through faith in Jesus, and they are attaining it. That's the contrast. It's not monergism versus synergism. It is faith versus works. That's what Paul is contrasting here. And we have to understand that in order to understand Paul's intention in Romans 9.
And I would even go so far as, I don't think I got a chance to say this in the debate, but the word faith isn't in the ground zero of Romans 9, this choosing of Jacob and Esau and all that, it's not mentioned, but it's implicit. Even Calvinist scholars will, in the phrase "not by works," where I think it's in verse 11, where Paul says that indicates that Paul has justification in view here. And how are we justified? We're justified by faith. So I think what Calvinists do is they contrast ethnicity and works versus God's choice. And they see this. They have this, like, when you're reading through Romans 9 and you see this, it's by him who calls. So they think that's just some empty category. It's just God's right to be God. He can choose whomever he wants. But if you read all the way through Romans, Paul is just, in chapter 4, he's explaining that God has chosen to have mercy through faith. That's the whole point. So God's choice, by the one who calls, it's not some empty category. It's basically God's right to say that I'm going to have mercy on those with faith. And
Right.
that's what's implicit in that portion of Romans 9. It's that this is by faith. That's what Paul's been talking about for a giant portion of Romans before we even get to Romans 8 or Romans 9. He's making this distinction between faith and works. And
Right.
and this is just, it's already implied. So there's no empty category of God just, he's the one who calls and he just makes these arbitrary choices. No, the choices that he made, the choice he made was to have mercy on those with faith. That's what Paul had spent all this time explaining to the reader. So
Right.
I think that needs to be in view. We can't ignore that.
And I think you're exactly right. And I think that there's also underneath that some figurative language, allegory, if you will, being used by Paul. And I don't say that lightly, because I would never say that if it wasn't for the fact that Galatians 4 actually says it specifically. And so if you, matter of fact, I was trying to pull open Galatians 4 while you were talking and I was messing up the screen. So I apologize for that for those that are watching. But Galatians 4, if you'll go there, I won't pull it up on the screen right now, but Galatians 4, Paul even says, I am speaking to you figuratively now. And he references Hagar versus Sarah. Okay. Now, many of you remember the story of Abraham. He was promised a child. He didn't get a child for a long time, and he was of age. His wife was of age. And so he was thinking, okay, this is not going to happen, so I've got to make it happen. In other words, he tries to work it out. Instead of waiting on the promise, he tries to make it happen himself. And he goes through Hagar, and that's when Ishmael comes, all right? Now, Ishmael is prayed for by Abraham. He's blessed by God and all those things within the scriptures. It shows that God shows favor to him and blesses that nation in other ways. But it was through works that Hagar has Ishmael. Okay, that's a representative of works. It's not my words. Go read Galatians 4. It's what Paul's saying. Okay, and then Sarah is representing the promise. Is that it's through Isaac, your seed will be reckoned. In other words, it's through waiting on the promise, and that's allegorically representative of faith. So if you believe, in other words, trust in God to provide the seed, trust in God to provide the child, if you trust in God, you will be reckoned as righteous. Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's faith. And so allegorically, in the mind of Paul, he's contrasting Ishmael with Isaac, because Ishmael represents Abraham's work through trying to make it happen himself, and Isaac represents waiting on the promise of God. And so even though, like you said, John, you're correct, he did not specifically mention faith right up at the beginning of Romans 9, but his reference to Ishmael and Isaac, through the readers would have recognized this because of his other teachings, like we see in Galatians 4, where he's clearly contrasting allegorically faith versus works, not monergism
Absolutely.
versus synergism. So it is God's right to choose. That's election, guys. It's God's right to elect his people. It's God's right to define who will be a part of his covenant people, how to enter covenant with him. It is his sovereign right to do that as he pleases. We think that's what Romans 9 is about. So anybody who says we don't think Romans 9 is about election or about God's sovereignty or about covenant heads or about people or about nations and the nations they represent and all of those things that Calvinists say that we don't think it's about, they don't understand our position. They have yet to understand both the duck and the rabbit, as I put it, of the Romans 9 debate. And I don't think I mean, I'm not trying to be mean to James White in saying this, But I still, based upon his conversation with you and his conversations with me and the interactions, I still don't think he understands what we're saying about Romans 9. I know he didn't when he was talking to Steve Gregg, because he was saying things that were blatantly, inconceivably said from somebody who would understand the more provisionist or traditionalist perspective, the non-Calvinistic perspective on that particular view. So side by side, besides provisionism, Calvinism would say, okay, so it's God's right to unconditionally choose certain individuals for effectual salvation. And so they think that's what Paul is trying to, that's the apostolic interpretation. So don't run off to the Old Testament, as James White says. Don't run off to the Old Testament and try to figure out what was happening in the context of God showing mercy or hardening, or look at the context of God's choice of Jacob.
Just read the Potter's Freedom, and then we'll figure out what Paul's talking about.
I guess. And I don't.
Just kidding.
I don't think he would say that, but
he might as well.
But yeah, I mean, where else is it? Because we're about to hear his answer to your question, because you're trying to get that answer. You're trying to say, okay, where in the text is it clearly this is about unconditional individuals being unconditionally chosen for effectual salvation? Where is it? Because he admits that Isaac, for example, wasn't chosen to be saved over his brothers. And I'm not just saying that. Let's read it, okay? Because I asked that question in the cross-examination. In fact, this was the first cross-examination. James White had just gotten up, and he had gone through Romans 8 and a portion of Romans 9 in his opener. By the way, most of his commentary on Romans 9 was fairly benign. He read a verse and then he would comment about the verse. Most of what he said in his opening, on my debate at least, was something I could have signed off on. In other words, he wasn't really hitting our points of contention. He wasn't saying anything, as David Allen puts it, Calvinists have the same vocabulary but a different dictionary. And so he was saying a lot of things that I would go, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that too. Yeah, I would say that too. But when he says the word election, and when he says God chose this person, he chose Jacob over Esau, I would say, yeah, he did. But in his mind, he means he chose him unconditionally to be saved. And I mean, no, he chose him to be the seed through which the promise would come. And so, in other words, James White's not focusing on the points of contention in his opener. I was trying to confront who the lump of clay represents. I was trying to confront who the objector in Romans 9 is, because if you understand those two things, you can't walk away with a Calvinistic rendering. I was trying in this question to hit on exactly what I think you were drilling in on your debate, which is, where are you getting unconditional election to salvation? Because the reference to Jacob and Esau and the reference to Isaac and Ishmael don't get us there. So where is it coming from? And when I asked that question about Isaac and his brothers and whether they were saved or not, or whether Esau was saved or not, do we know about their eternal destiny or their eternal salvation? Here is James White's answer, okay? It's on the screen. It's quoted verbatim. Nothing's changed here, so it's very simple for you to read for yourself. Because those individuals, he says, because those individuals are not even brought up, there is no discussion of what their eternal state was. And there was nothing in what I said that assigns the meaning of eternal salvation solely to the promises. So that if the promise is not brought to you, that means that you're eternally lost. So Paul doesn't even raise those objections. I don't know if anyone had ever raised them to him, but he does not even raise those objections in this text. And I would say it goes outside the realm of Romans 9 and what it's trying to communicate. Okay, so before you comment on this, John, let me just get my little soapbox out real quick. How in the world could any exegete tell us that what it meant in the Old Testament is not relevant? If Paul is quoting it, why in the world would you not want to, quote unquote, run off to the Old Testament context to find out what it meant then? Because otherwise you have Paul eisegeting the Old Testament in order to support this newfound theology. What say ye?
I agree. I think, well, there's a danger to that. Paul doesn't always take Old Testament passages literally in their context. Sometimes he brings out new meaning. He brings out allegory. He expands on things. Sometimes things they were prophecies that Old Testament readers didn't realize at the time. But there's a fine line between taking Old Testament passages with that methodology and just kind of making it mean whatever you want to. And that's the danger here. So there has to be some kind of standard here whereby Paul is not being guilty of eisegesis. So, that same question arises here. And something I'm kind of preempting here is just by reading this quote is, in case Dr. White, when he goes back to this quote and he limits it to talking only about the sons of Keturah and Lot, because he says here at the beginning, because those individuals are not even brought up. That's true. The sons of Keturah are not brought up by Paul. Lot is not brought up by Paul. But I think his quote cannot be limited to just talking about them because of what he says here, so that if the promise is not brought to you, that means that you're eternally lost. That would apply to Ishmael. That would apply to Esau. It expands to anybody who this promise is not brought to. And he also says that there's nothing in what I said that assigns the meaning of eternal salvation solely to the promises. So just in case he says, well, I was just talking about the sons of Keturah there and Lot. No, this expands to even those individuals that Paul did bring up in Romans 9. And that we have to find an account for this. Where are we getting this from? And I feel like that's something we have to keep hammering in this show with right now that we're recording. We just need to keep hammering it. Where are you getting this from, Dr. White? Or any Calvinist? Where is this coming from?
Where is it coming from? Because now all they have to is to appeal to apostolic interpretation, which is question begging because you're assuming that the Calvinistic interpretation is the apostolic interpretation. And so you got to do more than that. You can't just say, well, it's the apostolic interpretation. You've got to say, well, we know that's what Paul is using these texts to somehow allegorically represent, or some kind of it's an example. In other words, Paul is quoting this example of God's right to choose Jacob for being the carrier of the promise as his example of how Calvinism works. Okay, well,
I've heard. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's good. Go for it.
I've heard there's been other Calvinists who've kind of addressed this. They said, well, there's nothing wrong with what Dr. White said. It doesn't, to build the Reformed case of Romans 9, you don't need for the original context to speak to salvation. They feel like the case, like Tyler Vela is one of them. He said that the case can be built through context of what's going on in Romans 9. It can be built through that way. And here's the problem I have with that is I have contextual interpretations as well for what this choice is about. So, I mean, both sides have that. We have to get to, well, who has the weight of the evidence? Which side comes out on top? So if we abandon this whole, and I think that's what Dr. White would probably do, is just abandon, we don't need the original context to know what Paul is talking about. We have context clues through Romans 9. We have Romans 8. We have these other things. But again, our side has that too. So what kind of raises the Calvinist side over our side? Where's the weight of the evidence? So we need more than that.
And I think the other point on our favor is that the Old Testament context can mean exactly what the Old Testament context means in our interpretation. In other words, we're perfectly fine with the fact that Jacob was chosen to be the carrier of the promise, not that he was unconditionally chosen for salvation. And that works with our interpretation. Not only does it work with our interpretation of Romans 9, but guess what? It also works with our interpretation of chapters 10 and 11. Because even James White has to he admits in his discussion with Austin Fisher that, well, James White says, well, in order to understand Romans 11, you have to Paul shifts to a more corporate perspective. And so he thinks it's about individuals in Romans 9, but then whenever those same individuals who are hardened in Romans 9 are being grafted back in, if they're provoked to envy, as chapter 14 says, the same one who stumbled in Romans 9 are the same ones he says haven't stumbled beyond recovery in chapter 11. Well, the way James White deals with that, he says Paul is saying, well, this is corporately and generally speaking. He's not talking about individuals anymore. And so that's troublesome too, because you're shifting your way of doing exegesis to fit the Calvinistic narrative. Well, guess what? I don't have to shift from Romans 9 through 11 at all in my approach.
At all.
I don't have to eisegete any of the Old Testament text to make it fit my hermeneutical structure. So that's a point in our favor, I think, because if the Old Testament meant the same thing in Paul's mind in Romans 9 as it does in Exodus 32 and 33, or any of the other passages he's quoting out of Genesis or Malachi, then it makes much more sense, and it's consistent throughout the interpretation of the Scriptures, which is an important, very important point. Now, you quoted this right here in your debate from my debate with him in our opening cross-examination. I hadn't even presented yet, okay? And so I had not done a presentation. I had just cross-examined him, and this is the answer he gave. And then you pushed him on that in the Justin Brierley program, on the Unbelievable program. And before he answered, they cut away to commercial. Yeah. And then they come back from a commercial, and Justin Brierley reiterates your question and even refers back to this quote. And he even says something about, well, if the promise is, brought, doesn't mean that they're necessarily eternally lost, then why is Paul quoting from that to support individual election to salvation? And here's James White's answer up on the screen, okay? He says this: well, first of all, that was an answer to a cross-examination thing. It was not a part of my presentation. I was just desperately, and he put that emphasis on the word, not just me, okay? I was just desperately trying to get Leighton Flowers to even touch on Romans 9, which was very, very difficult to do in that particular debate, as anyone who listens to it knows. So what I was saying was, let's stick to what the text says. You're bringing up extraneous issues that wasn't even in Paul's intention to address. But that's a misrepresentation of what I said. If you're saying that means this is not soteriological in form. All right, so let's try to unpack that slowly and carefully. First, he's trying to red herring it here by saying that the reason he gave that answer was just trying to keep me on task, because obviously, I was way out of Romans 9. Heaven forbid we look at the context of the verses that Paul is quoting from in the Old Testament, because that has nothing to do with Romans 9. You can't run off to the Old Testament to actually see what it meant in its context, because we have to look at the apostolic interpretation, i.e. we have to listen to James White tell us what the apostolic interpretation is Calvinistically in order for us to have a debate. It's just
what you can find here.
Yeah,
for $9.99.
You can that's the apostolic interpretation. You can find out the apostolic interpretation.
I'm just kidding.
We have to pick on him a little bit. We have to push on him a little bit.
It's not an insult. We're just joking.
I'm sure he would pick on us too. Okay, so I do think what it meant in the Old Testament is important. I do think it's important, and I do think that Paul quoting from it in its proper context is important. And I wasn't trying to get off topic of Romans 9. I was trying to help people to see the actual meaning in Paul's mind in Romans 9, which again, if we go back to what we said before, it's God's right to choose how to define his covenant people. In other words, God can show mercy when he wants to show mercy to somebody, even if they're a rebellious Samaritan. And God can define who's a part of his people through faith if he wants to. It's his right to do what he wants to do. And Paul is showing that to a group of mostly Israelite type people who are having objections in this way. It sounds like you've got somebody paging you there, so I'll let you get that. I'll pause.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So glad you're back. You had to celebrate a victory in potty training. It sounded like, right?
That's right. That's right.
So what was your thought when he brought this up? That he's obviously desperately trying to keep poor little Leighton Flowers on topic here, but what were your thoughts?
Well, I prepared for this debate for months. I watched as many debates as I could get my hands on, and that one was key. So I watched your debate and Dr. White's so many times, and I knew right away that was the debate was set up really weird. It was he gave a presentation. And instead of you giving your presentation, there was a cross-exam. It was kind of weird how they just kind of shoved that in there. But your question, you had not even made a presentation yet. So when he says, I was just desperately trying to get Leighton Flowers to touch on Romans 9, you didn't even present yet. You were he's just sat down and you were cross-examining him. That's how the debate was structured. So you weren't even off topic. You didn't even get to present yet. So that's just
and plus,
not even true.
Plus, it also assumes that what the Old Testament context means can't apply to Romans 9, and that's just, when you think about it, how asinine is that? I'm not trying to be. That's just how in the world could anybody say what it meant in the original context should not even be taken into view when you're trying to decide what Paul was meaning by quoting it. That is the most baffling thing. Now, I can understand saying,
right.
Go ahead. No,
I was going to say that's kind of out of Joel Osteen's playbook. You know what I mean? If we're taking things out of context, I'm just saying we got to be careful when we do that. So
well, it's like the picture that I saw on Twitter. It was a picture of a runner. And it's quoting out of Romans 9. Did you see that? We're quoting out of Romans 9. He says, "I will raise you up. I will raise you up for this very purpose, to display my power through you." And it was used, that quote, as a quote for athletes, that God's going to show His power through you as athletes. It's just like, oh no, that's a little bit of proof texting. But who cares?
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter what it meant in the original context. I'm providing a new pastoral interpretation of what Paul meant, and I'm saying God's going to raise up athletes to display His power through them. So it doesn't matter what it meant in the original context. I can eisegete New Testament text the same way that Paul eisegeted Old Testament text in order to make my points. So
apparently.
Well, and maybe I'm being too dramatic on that point. You're correct in saying that yes, there are some Old Testament texts. There are prophecies being fulfilled, and the apostles are bringing light to new truths. For example, you got Moses, for example, referred to in Hebrews as being a type of almost a Messiah type figure, and there's some things reference to Melchizedek and some other things that are unpacked for us by the apostles. And so in that sense, and I'm sure that's what James White and other Calvinists probably have in mind, that Paul is trying to do something like that here. He is trying to take something from the Old Testament, and he's using that to demonstrate how soteriology works with regard to the salvation of individuals. So in the same way, again, I'm trying to put on my Calvinist hat and be as fair as possible, okay? In the same way that God chose Jacob to be the carrier of the promise, and that's His right as a sovereign king to choose Jacob and not his big brother, even though his big brother was obviously the more likely candidate. Well, in the same way, God can choose one person over another to be effectually changed, to be individually chosen for salvation, and this is the way God works. I'm assuming that that's the way they were taking it, but your question, I think, is a valid one, and you're pushing him. Okay, where does the Bible say that, though? Okay, I understand your book says that, but where does the Bible say that?
Right. How does I offer? I have my own reason for why Paul brings up the choice. You know what I mean? It's kind of back to what you said. It's God's right to define who covenant people are. So I have an interpretation of what the choice represents. Right. The Calvinist does. So now we have to look at Paul. Okay, so does Paul lean more towards what the Calvinist thinks he's meaning, or does Paul kind of lean more towards what we think is going on? So it's like the Calvinist needs to offer something, and this is what I've told people online since this debate. To get to the conclusion that Dr. White gets to, there's a missing premise, and we got to find it. We have to figure out, okay, what is Paul getting at, and how do we know this? Because I feel like at this point it's well, I mean, obviously I think our way goes, there's more weight of the evidence, there's less assumptions, and which is a sign of a good theory. The less assumptions you got to pack into it, the better, as opposed to the Calvinist interpretation. So we got to figure out where's the weight of the evidence.
So in other words, it's not an extraneous issue if indeed Paul is quoting the Old Testament in order to demonstrate his right to define his covenant people, because that's exactly what he's doing when it comes to him choosing Jacob over Esau.
He's basically, Romans 9 is, he's trying to, okay, who does the promise come to? And who decides that? Because the whole thing is about the promise. The promise has not failed. So why hasn't the promise failed? Then who gets to decide who gets the promise? God does. Right. And so when God is picking Isaac over Ishmael, when he's picking, and I hate to keep reiterating this choice that we see, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, God is deciding who gets the promise.
Right.
He's not deciding who gets saved. He's not deciding which individual will be in heaven with me. He's deciding which people. How do I define these people, and who receives these promises? And that's all that's going on.
Right.
As far as
and
without assuming anything extra. So.
And that point you just made, John, is exactly the point I was trying to illustrate by looking at Jesus' illustration in Matthew 22, the parable of the banquet. And of course he says, oh, you're going again outside of Romans 9. That was my rebuttal period. And because I used Matthew 22, which people who know the banquet parable is God's choice of the kingdom. He chooses servants to take the invitations to his own kingdom first. When they reject it, he sends them to the highways and byways and says, invite whoever will come. All of those are choices of God. He chooses his own people, which is representative of his choice of Israel. He chooses servants, which would be representative of his choice of prophets, people like Jacob and others that God did individually choose as servants. And then his choice of who they would go to. Well, first they would go to the Israelite people. The gospel goes first to the Jew and then to the Gentile, then to the highways and byways, to the good and the bad alike. All of those are, in a sense, an unconditional choices of God. God chooses all of those things, but none of those have to do with individuals being chosen for an effectual salvation. All of those have to do with God bringing his promise to bless all the families of the earth, which is, again, that very first thing we read in Genesis chapter 12. This is God's plan to bring a blessing to all the families of the earth through this seed. And none of that has to do with individuals being chosen for election. And that's what I was trying to illustrate in that point with Matthew 22. And it's just funny to me because Paul is one of those people who is being stoned and trying to be killed for bringing the invitations to the highways and the byways. In that parable, the Matthew 22 parable, Paul is living out that parable live, and they don't think it relates to Romans 9. I'm like, how in the world can you not look at Jesus' parable, which is ultimately a prophecy of what's going to happen to the apostles, and think that has nothing to do with the context of Romans 9? Because he's saying he loves the very people who are trying to throw him into prison and to stone him, and he's bringing them the message, and he's bringing the message to the Gentiles, and his own people are trying to condemn him for it. That's exactly what Matthew 22 parable was prophesying will happen. And it also illustrates really clearly to us the elections of God, the choices of God, the choice of his servants, the choice of who he will take the message to, and then only, finally, many are called, few are elect, few are chosen. Well, who are the ones who are chosen? Those who come clothed in the right wedding garments. In other words, those who have faith, those who believe in God, whether Jew, whether Gentile, whether from the highways or the byways or from his own kingdom. Only those who were clothed in the right wedding garments were granted entrance. That is the few who are elect, those who are in Christ, clothed in him.
And who gets to decide that? God. And that's
James
the whole
White.
point of Romans 9.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm being snarky.
Yeah.
Being snarky.
And I kind of want to highlight this. I'm thinking back to when, as I mentioned in the debate to Justin Brierley, is just, how I'd always see Romans 9 in a Calvinist lens. I really didn't know I couldn't see it any other way because that's the way it was explained to me for so many years. But even just looking at the screen now, God's purpose in election, they say, so that his purpose in election might stand. The Calvinists will read that as it's just so God can make a choice. So God gets to choose who gets saved and who doesn't. That totally decontextualizes that phrase from everything else you see in Scripture. The purpose of election is what you just showed. It's so that God can save mankind, to bring the Messiah to earth. He is electing a people, the Jews, so that this can happen, so that the Messiah can come into the world. It's not just so God can make a choice. It's so that he can save. John 3:16, basically in action. That is the purpose of election. That is the purpose behind God's choosing these patriarchs, for choosing Israel, is so John 3:16 can happen. So that when I saw that's what that means, as opposed to just so God can make a choice, like a light bulb went off, among many other light bulbs that went off. But that definitely is, definitely helped me. So
well, and I think also people who say that has nothing to do with what Romans 9's about either are forgetting verses 4 and 5. the people of Israel. There's the adoption to sonship. There's the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all forever and ever praised. In other words, he just now went, before he gets to verse 6, which I agree with James White is kind of the crux of everything, in the sense of setting it up, has God's promise failed? Has his promise to bring the Messiah and his blessing through the people of Israel, has that failed? I mean, the people aren't even accepting Christ as their Messiah. It looks like it's all failed, and that launches into the discourse that we're getting into. But verse 4 and 5 really is touching on that very point of God's election of Israel. Why has he chosen Israel? What is he accomplishing through Israel? Is he going to keep accomplishing that through Israel? Yes, and he's going to do that sometimes by showing them mercy, like when they try to build a golden calf and deserve to be destroyed, and he shows them mercy. He's patient with them. He's long-suffering towards objects that have prepared themselves for wrath, and he lets them continue to live so as to fulfill his promise through them, and he can harden them when it serves his purpose, like he's doing in Paul's day. And God is sovereign in his right, again, his right to choose how to define his covenant people. And when his people through whom he's chosen are rebellious and running away like Jonah did, well, guess what? God has at his disposal a big fish sometimes. He's got a blinding light sometimes if it's Paul. But guess what? God can make sure his chosen people get the message to where he wants it to go. Now, does proof that God uses outward external means like a blinding light or big fish to convince his messengers to go where he wants them to go, does that prove that he has chosen which person will believe that message through some inner irresistible means? That's such a non sequitur. It makes no sense to say, oh, well, look, God used a big fish to convince Jonah's will. Therefore, he's probably already pre-chosen certain Ninevites that he's going to use some inward irresistible thing to make them believe Jonah's message when he gets there. It just doesn't compute. Yeah. But that's exactly what Calvinists, I think, have done throughout the New Testament text, is they've taken verses about God's sovereign right to choose Israel and even use signs and wonders like showing Thomas his nail-scarred hands, like walking on water in front of the apostles, to convince them through these signs that he is who he says he was, that's somehow a proof text for Calvinism, i.e. they'll quote from passages like, "Oh, I thank you, God, that you've revealed this to babes, but you've hidden it from the wise and learned." Well, what's the context of that verse? Because I hear Calvinists quote it as if it supports Calvinistic soteriology. Well, the context is, I've chosen fishermen to be my messengers. I've chosen fishermen of this day to be the Jonahs that take the message to the world. And not the wise and learned, not the guys with the phylacteries and the big robes who are leading the cities of that day. I've chosen small, insignificant people to bring my message to the world. And what a Calvinist has done is taken that, plucked it out of its context and goes, oh, look, God has individually chosen some people for salvation to the neglect of the rest. Oh, man. No, that's not at all the context of what Paul is talking about or any of the other New Testament writers. But did we get the answer we wanted from James White? Now, that's the first. Yeah, that's the first question. That's the first time Justin posed the question right after the commercial break. And then his last sentence there, I want to get your commentary on that, because he says, but that's a misrepresentation of what I said if you're saying that means this is not soteriological in form. Now, for White, soteriological means Calvinistically soteriological.
Yep.
And so what he means is that, okay, your quote of me from Leighton Flowers' debate that obviously agrees that just because the promise is brought to Jacob or to Isaac doesn't necessarily mean that the other brothers are eternally lost, and that they're absolutely saved because the promise is brought to them. He already admitted that. But then he says, but if you think that means it's not supporting Calvinism, then you're misrepresenting me or you're not understanding. Is that pretty much how you took his answer?
Yeah, and it just kind of, it really wasn't much of an answer at all, because we both agree, even at the outset, if you listen to the debate, my first presentation is I agree with Dr. White that Romans 9 is soteriological, but we have to, again, we're just back to the question, okay, what does that mean? What kind of soteriology? Is it the kind that unconditionally elects individuals, or is it the kind I think it's just talking about why the Jews aren't being saved and their relationship with the gospel. That fits under the same umbrella term called soteriology. So I think we still have to figure out what Paul means by these things.
Right.
And that is definitely not an answer to that. He's just, okay, we're in agreement on that. So.
Okay. So you press him again later in the broadcast, which, by the way, kudos. That's probably, if I had a regret of my debate with White, it might have been that I tried to hit on too many points of contention. And so instead of really hammering down and pushing in on that point, I may have jumped to, okay, well, I want to talk about the lump of clay. Who does the lump of clay represent, for example? Does it represent all of humanity from birth? Or is this representing as a natural condition of all humanity, and God can shape some of the lump of humanity into Christians and to some lump into reprobates? Is that what he's talking about? Because I wanted to demonstrate that no, he's talking about hardened Israel, and that God can shape this hardened lump of Israelite clay into the means and purposes that that serves his purpose. That's what I wanted to emphasize in my debate, and then I also wanted to emphasize who's the objector. Relate that back to Romans 3 and show obviously the objector in Romans 3 is Israelite. It even says so, and he's asking the question: if my unrighteousness brings out your righteousness more clearly, then why am I to be judged? Which is exactly the same objector in Romans 9, who's saying, why are we to blame if you're the one shaping us into this hardened clay as rebellious against God, and you're using us to bring a blessing to the rest of the nations through us crying out, crucify him, and through the ingrafting of the Gentiles, then why are we to be blamed? That's the objector. And so I tried to cover all of that in my debate because I thought all those points were important. What you did, and I think was really wise, was you honed in on that one point. You just said, no, we're not going to go into all the other stuff yet. Let's just talk about unconditional election to salvation. Where is that established? And so good job for you, especially in a limited amount of time that you had on a Justin Brierley program, the way that it's set up. I think you did a really good job by just focusing on that one question.
Thank you.
Do you feel like you got an answer to it?
No, I got no, and we're about to find out.
All right, you want to put it up on the screen? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we typed out verbatim.
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
His answer.
This is Dr. White's words. We're not putting words in his mouth. And this is when I pressed him again on this, because at the very beginning of the debate, I said his view has to be established between verses 6 through 13. Because if, as the Calvinist says, why is Romans 9 so objectionable? Well, let's look at verse 14. Here's somebody objecting to it. That's a synergist. Okay, so if the Calvinist says they're objecting to unconditional election, it has to be established somewhere before that. It's not in verses 1 through 5, because that's just Paul just bewailing the condition of Israel. So it's something Paul says in between. So that's why I pressed him again. I was like, okay, Dr. White, this is where I kind of made the offensive attack. If your view holds up, you have to establish that it's talking about unconditional election between 6 and 13. And I feel his quote kind of undermines that, so I pressed him again. This is the key. This is ground zero of Romans 9.
Right.
Because if this isn't established here, it's established nowhere. None of the other objections follow.
Now, I put back up on the screen.
That's why I pressed them again.
Well, I put back up on the screen the difference between provisionism and Calvinism there. God's right to choose how to define his covenant people. Now, our interpretation of Paul quoting from those Old Testament texts establishes that, because it's clearly God's right to choose how to define his covenant people. And I think even
the promise.
Right, exactly. Yep. And so I think even a Calvinist would agree, that's established. Okay, so we would all agree that's been at least that bar has been reached by Paul quoting from those Old Testament texts. But that's not the bar the Calvinist has to reach. They have to reach this bar over here, that God has unconditionally chosen certain individuals to be effectually saved through some regenerative means. Okay, you've got to get there. Okay. Now, some Calvinists will say, well, we don't get there in Romans 9. We have to bring in Ephesians 1. We got to get some, Exodus 13:48, maybe, John 6, and we systematically understand all of these things together. Okay, you can try to make that case if you'd like to, but when you're debating Romans 9 and you're insisting that your opponent stays in the chapter, that's the problem. You can't get there in Romans 9. and you have to confess that and or claim that your opponent doesn't know how to do exegesis and just not answer his objections, one of the two. So let's look at James White's answer. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
I'll let you read it. This again is when I just for viewers when I pressed him again on his quote, So, and here's a more robust answer, but it's really not much of an answer. So I'll let you read it, Dr. Flowers.
Okay. Here's what James White says. Quote, asked and answered. Now, let me stop right there real quick before I should just read it. But has he answered it? And that's the question. You just saw his answers. We just typed them out. Has he answered that question? Now, if we missed something in the discussion, I went back and listened to it. I don't think we missed anything. Did we, John, about any of his other answers?
No. Now, he answered questions about other parts of Romans 9. So, we're not talking about did he answer things. We're talking about did he answer the use of his quote. So this is a very specific thing I was pressing him on.
Right.
And as far as that goes, no, he kind of went off on other tangents. We brought up Jeremiah 18. We brought up all these other things. So did he answer his use, what he admitted in his quote? No.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Right.
I don't think we missed that.
Right. And so because what you're drilling down on here is where is it established in Romans 9 that unconditional election to effectual salvation is established? Because you even admitted in your quote the original context of the Old Testament from Isaac and Jacob don't necessarily mean that in the original context. So where is it coming from? And then you pressed him on that and you said asked and answered. Let me mention it again. Verse 22, make his wrath known. What is wrath? Who is wrath for? For the elect? The wrath of God has been dealt with in Jesus Christ. So if you're experiencing the wrath of God, you're not of the elect. This is illustrating chapter 8, which talks about the elect of God, who have a Savior who intercedes for them, and therefore nothing can separate them from the love of God. And then it's, well, why isn't that for all the people of God, the Old Testament people of God? We're coming right back around. Now that Paul has established what is establishing the freedom of God, we're coming right back around. And so when you have terms such as wrath, and you have terms such as destruction, and you have terms such as mercy and glory, where do we see glory before? That's at the end of the golden chain. Those whom he predestined, called, justified. What's the last one? Glorified. So we're having the exact same terms repeated at the end of this argument. And I'm simply saying, if we're talking about any other subject, if we were talking about the resurrection, if we were talking about, well, I was going to say eschatology, but I'm not sure any two Christians actually could agree on eschatology. But if we are talking about any other aspect of theology that didn't, for example, touch upon the issues of the will of man, simply exegetical consistency would make us go, looks like an argument that had a beginning and an end here. We're repeating phrases, repeating concepts here. Let's take this as a whole instead of breaking it up into all these little pieces that has been done during the conversation, end quote.
Okay, so let me remind the viewer here, or anybody who listens to the debate, I established, and I kind of mentioned it here in this interview with Dr. Flowers, I said, this objection, unconditional election of salvation, has to be established in Romans 9, between verses 6 through 13. Does he mention anything about Romans 9? At all, especially in that little portion. If you look at this quote, there's nothing there about that. He's going back to Romans 8. He's basically importing what I think is it's basically begging the question for Calvinism. He's taking an interpretation of Romans 8 that favors Calvinism, and he imports it into Romans 9. So when I ask him about this, I'm asking him about these individuals in Romans 9. How do we know? How do we know what Paul's point is in Romans 9? He ignores all that and goes back to Romans 8. So pretty much this entire answer is just, well, we see this in Romans 8. We see these same themes being repeated. We see the golden chain. Again, he's just he's importing a question-begging interpretation of Romans 8 that favors Calvinism onto Romans 9. He ignored what I said about the individuals. He ignored what I said about Paul's point in bringing them up, and he just skipped right back to Romans 8. And even at the beginning of this answer, he skips verses 6 through 13 and goes up to verse 22. And he talks about wrath. Okay, well, how do we get to verse 22 yet? We have to get through 6 through 13. I agree there's wrath going on. I agree the elect are not experiencing the wrath of God, but we're trying to figure out who are the elect and how are they elected, and it's still unanswered.
Right.
And so you can't just appeal to a question-begging interpretation of Romans 8 that favors your tradition and say that's the answer. No, it's not. The question is still open. We haven't established it.
Right.
And so I don't think that's an answer at all. Just a bunch of words,
it's also, again, it's a little bit of also begging the question to assume that Romans 8 is interpreted Calvinistically too. And obviously you presented, I think, as well as you could in the short amount of time that you had, an alternative translation or understanding of Romans chapter 8 to be in reference to prognosko or foreknowledge as being referring back to those he's known in the past, formerly known, which is the most basic and simple reading of that term, I think. And I have commentary on that in my book as well as online. But there's also other Arminians who interpret Romans 9 in different ways with regard to foreknowledge, more of a foresight perspective or a corporate perspective.
Oh, you mean Romans 8?
Excuse me,
right?
Romans 8, correct.
Yeah.
And so you can't just assume Romans 8:28 and following is Calvinistic supporting. You've got to make that argument, which of course he has materials that do that, and we have materials that that counter that and that provide our presentation as well. And so, in other words, just because Paul brings up wrath and glory, he'll say, well, those are soteriological terms, as if that proves his case. It's like saying, okay, well, obviously there's wrath here, there's choice here, there's individuals here, there's glory here, so it's obviously Calvinism. And we're going, okay, so how in the world does that counter what you just brought up about wrath and glory? How does that counter what we think Paul is talking about when he says it's God's right to choose how to define his covenant people? Aren't those who are outside his covenant going to experience wrath, whether you're a Calvinist or not? Well, yes. Aren't those who are within his covenant going to experience glory and be glorified? Well, yes. So those who have faith, even if it's libertarianly freely done through like the non-Calvinistic worldview, would they still have wrath and glory? Would there still be mercying and hardening? Yes. All of those terms are still consistent with our interpretation. So just quoting those words as if they support you is not an argument. And that's exactly what he did in my debate, and it's exactly what he did in your debate, is that he goes, oh, well, look at the apostolic interpretation, and then he quotes verbatim from Romans 9, and then just is like, see? Oh, okay. So what did you just prove by quoting verbatim what Paul just said in Romans 9? Because just because it says wrath and glory and mercy and hardening doesn't necessarily mean that your interpretation of those terms are the correct ones. You have to establish, using historical context, using other verses to be brought in to inform us of what Paul might be talking about, like we do with Galatians 4, like we might do with Romans chapter 11, like we might do with Ephesians chapter 1 or some other passages. But you cannot just assume your reading of those verses just because they sound like what you assume they sound like. And I think that was my frustration in my debate, and I think we saw it replayed in some level in the debate on unbelievable.
Yep. Exactly.
What other points do you think weren't maybe covered that need to be covered or understood from that debate? What can we press maybe our Calvinistic friends on just to say, okay, whether you're a James White fan or not, who cares? That's not important. I think even Calvinists would admit it's not about John Calvin. It's not about James White. Those who hold to my view, I hope they know it has nothing to do with me, or those of Arminian persuasion have anything to do with Jacobus Arminius or, Brian Abishano or some other Arminian that's well known. It doesn't have to do with any person. It's what does the text mean in its context? What was Paul saying in the original context? And we've got to best understand that. How would you challenge, or maybe what other words would you say as we close this down?
What I would say is I think my central question, my main argument to Dr. White, I still think it's unanswered and it still stands. And I feel that any Calvinist, you have to establish that what Paul is talking about. If you say that if you're going to use Romans 9 as a proof text, to me, in my mind, when I hear about a proof text, I think it's this isolated text that gets you to your conclusion. You don't need to import other things into it to get there. Now, sure, like what you just said, Leighton, you could build your case cumulatively with other passages, and you could say, okay, well, see, God does predestine, God does elect that way. But again, then you're admitting implicitly that Romans 9 is not a proof text, because you can't establish it by itself. You have to bring in other things. You have to import things. And so my challenge to the Calvinists is, again, through Romans 9, verses 6 through 13, something Paul says in there brings rise to that first objection. The objector finds something offensive, and the Calvinist says it's because Paul brings up unconditional election of salvation. You have to show that. And a lot of times what I've been seeing is that people are bringing in Romans 8, which is fine. You can make that case. But again, it has to, what's going on between our camp and the Calvinist camp is that we have explanations, we have interpretations, we have context, and the Reformed camp has as well. There has to be something that gives you more weight of the evidence than ours, because right. I feel that our interpretation is really consistent. There's less assumptions, and so you can't act like we don't have anything on the table. What you have to do is have something extra. You have to have this missing premise that Paul is talking about unconditional election of salvation. You have to find out. You have to show us how you get there.
Right.
Now, if you're going to go into Romans 8, that's fine. But again, what you're doing by doing that is you're saying that you can't do it in Romans 9. You have to go somewhere else to find it. Again, that's fine. But also keep in mind, put yourself in our shoes. We have interpretations of Romans 8 as well. So there has to be something extra there. You know what I mean? Otherwise, you're just begging the question. So that's kind of my challenge. And I feel even in our debate even in my debate with Dr. White, I felt like he was kind of skirting around Jeremiah 18 and just even if this potter is reshaping these vessels, when you go back to Jeremiah 18, it's conditional. And then I've had somebody online say, well, we're not committed to only referencing the potter vessel analogy in Jeremiah 18. We can also go to Isaiah 29. We can go to Isaiah 45. Yes, there are potter vessel analogies there, but none of them are deterministic. There's nothing there that undermines what I just said. Right. And if you take it collectively, that, I've had this argued to me that Paul is not referencing one particular chapter. He's not just referencing Jeremiah 18. At that time frame, there was this collective motif about what the Jews thought about the potter and vessels. So it's a collection of these ideas, and they appear in different areas. Again, if that's true, that does nothing to undermine the fact that in that collection is Jeremiah 18, and it is conditional. So that we have to deal with that. The Calvinist has to deal with that. And then Paul himself, I believe he interprets it as this potter vessel analogy as conditional. He does it in 2 Timothy 2.
Oh, there it is.
There's an if-then statement. So if we want the apostolic interpretation, let's go and see what he says. And he interprets it conditionally.
Right.
So we have this long attestation of it being conditional. And why would we break from that when it comes to Romans 9?
Right.
And if we don't break from it, if it is conditional, whose theory makes better sense with it? It's definitely not the Calvinists. I would say it's the non-Calvinist interpretation.
You made a lot of good points there, and you were reading my mind, because I was actually bringing up Paul's quote out of 2 Timothy 20, where it says, in a large house there are articles not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. In other words, there's clay pots. That's what he's talking about. Some are for special purposes. In other words, it's exactly the same analogy that some are shaped for special purposes, some for common use, some are chamber pots, in other words, but some are the special, china and that you only bring out for guests. That's what he's talking about. He says, those who cleanse themselves from the latter will be instruments for special purposes. In other words, human responsibility is still connected to the clay pot. Same in Jeremiah 18. It does not, referring to an analogy of a pot, does not remove the individual responsibility of that pot to confess, to humble themselves, to cleanse themselves. And that's what's interesting there, is it even says cleanse themselves. Even that in our vernacular in a theology debate would be accused of being Pelagian of some sort. But obviously Paul wasn't concerned about such nonsense back in the day. Whenever he says cleanse yourself, what is he talking about? He's saying, well, confess your sins so as to be cleansed by the blood of Christ. He's not literally saying, you give yourself heart surgery or you save yourself, just like when Peter refers to in Acts 2:40, save yourself from this corrupt generation. He's not literally saying a Pelagius theology, hey, you can save yourself. No, he's saying trust in Jesus so as to be saved. And so when he says cleanse yourself, he's saying the same thing. Trust in God, confess your sins so as to be cleansed, and then you'll be an instrument for special purposes, not for common. And I think that's so clearly obvious whenever you see the whole counsel of God's word, that he's not trying to remove human free will by referring to clay pots. He's instead talking about, in context of Israel, who has chosen their ways and have grown hardened and calloused in their rebellion, being now given over or strengthened in their resolve is what the word hardening means, to give them over to their rebellious and sinful ways as old wineskins that can't take the new wine now. They are self-righteous, they're rebellious, and God is using, not causing, using their self-righteous rebellion after showing so much patience toward them, after holding out his hand to them for so long. He's letting them go their own way, and he's using them in that rebellious condition, much like he did Pharaoh, so as to bring about the Passover. And that's exactly what Paul's communicating in Romans 9. And once you see that, you go, oh, wow, I don't need this big quandary that the Calvinistic system ultimately reads onto this text with, this double predestination and God reprobating babies before they're ever born for no apparent reason, and this whole controversy that just erupted the church in the 5th century, introduced first by Augustine, who was very much not a consistent Calvinist by any stretch of the imagination. That's speaking anachronistically, obviously, but Augustine believed in baptismal regeneration of infants. Augustine thought you could lose your salvation. A lot of people don't know that. Even though he maintained predeterminism and all the other things, he still thought you could lose your salvation. He held to a lot of very strange views that Calvin himself and other Calvinists would not have adhered to today. But he was the first one, even by Calvin's own record and by many Calvinistic scholars' own record, was the first to introduce many of these types of more deterministic readings of Romans 9 and other text in question, which is, again, goes back to your weight issue, where you're talking about a scale. Because when there's debatable verses, and there are a lot of debatable verses about, okay, which interpretation is likely right here? Both of them fall within orthodoxy in the sense that people throughout Christian history have held to both of these views. And therefore, both smart people, there's smart people on both sides, so I can't appeal to authority. I can't appeal to just popularity, because I for every 5 scholars you can find, I can find another 5 scholars that believe what I do, so I can't just do that. But I've got to look at all these things, and I've got to look at the weight scale. Which one is going to push me towards unconditional election of certain individuals to salvation, and which one points more towards what the Old Testament context actually was referring to, God's right to choose how to define his own covenant people the way he wants to, and through them to bless all the nations of the earth. Okay, which one's more likely, given the full context of especially chapter 10 and 11? And I agree. I think it's really, really heavily weighted towards our interpretation. Now, I understand if you've got the Calvinistic lenses on, meaning you have read through a certain lens, determinism, theistic determinism, compatibilism, whatever you want to call it. You've read it with those lenses on, then you have a tendency when you read Romans 9 to go, well, obviously that's soteriologically Calvinistic. And I get that because I think, like you, when Calvinism is introduced to you and then you're introduced to Romans 9 in the context of Calvinism, it does look like it's supporting Calvinism if you're looking at it from that lens and from that perspective. But it's only when you back away far enough, take off the lenses, look at the context, look at the issues being raised, look at the Old Testament context he's quoting from, which James White says you don't need to run off to do that because it's not relevant. I'm saying it is relevant. You should know what the Old Testament context means. He's saying, no, don't look there. Don't look behind the curtain. And I'm saying, yeah, you need to know everything. You need to know what it meant back then and what Paul was possibly using it to mean today. And I think that's worth a discussion. And the only time a real debate happens over Romans 9 is when both opponents understand well enough their opponent's perspective to actually confront that perspective. And that was my biggest frustration with my James White debate, is that I still don't think he understands provisionism. I still don't think he understands traditionalism or what we believe about Romans 9. I know he doesn't understand Stephen Gregg, and he holds to the same interpretation that I do. Michael Brown, from everything I've heard Michael Brown say about Romans 9 at least, supports our perspective, our interpretation, for the most part. So how is he qualified to debate us if he can't articulate what we're saying? And I haven't seen it.
I want to speak to that. Let me speak to that. Just as somebody who's gone on this journey myself, and you describe it perfectly, being able to see this duck and rabbit, you see something a certain way. I just want to kind of harken back to, I think it's 2 Peter 3:16, where Peter himself acknowledges that sometimes the things the Apostle Paul writes are hard to understand. And the ignorant twist it. And I'm not saying Calvinists are ignorant, but what I'm saying is that sometimes when you're looking at the things Paul says, especially if you're reading it in a certain way that calls into question God's character, you better slow down, because you might be seeing a surface, a veneer that's not really there. So you might have to go and dig a little deeper than that, because the things that Paul writes are sometimes very hard to understand. You have to do a lot of digging to get to the bottom of it. And this is something, so I want to challenge just Calvinist listeners, take time to understand what we're saying here. Don't rush to just get into an argument with us or with Leighton or me or whoever in a comment section. Slow down and take time and read the best material you can find about this position. Don't come up with straw mans and weak arguments. Read what you think is the best summary of these arguments. Because it took me a long time before I could see it, and now that I do, I don't see anything else. And I didn't force it. I did take my time with it. So I want to challenge just the Calvinist listeners, when you go to engage on this, take time to actually understand what we're saying. Don't just jump the gun. Don't get offensive, or don't get defensive about it. Just kind of explore it and marinate on it. Try to put yourself in our shoes. Try to see what we're seeing, because we see what you see. I've seen it for years. So has Dr. Flowers. So take your time with this and try to really understand what it is we're saying here. So
yeah, and I'll give a word also to those who don't believe in Calvinism and are anti-Calvinists in that regard. They really don't like the doctrine, and I understand your animosity towards it. But as a former Calvinist, I can only say this: when I thought that's what Romans 9 was teaching, I was honestly trying to defend the Word of God to the best of my ability. And I honestly believe that's what Paul was teaching in Romans 9, Ephesians 1, John 6. I thought that's what was being said. And so the way and you would appreciate this, John, having children, and you were just talking about your 5-year-old. If your 5-year-old accidentally knocks over the lamp while he's cleaning up his room, how is the discipline going to be different than if he's upset with you, he's angry with you, and he runs in and he purposely pushes the lamp off of the desk? I think as well as anybody, as a daddy, your response is going to be very different in those two situations. What's the difference? It's motivation. He's trying to clean his room. He's trying to obey his daddy. He's trying to do the right thing, and he accidentally knocks over the lamp. His motivation's right. He's trying to do the right thing. He's just made a mistake. If he's running into the room and knocking it down out of anger, then the discipline's going to be harsher, and you're going to be more angry with him. Okay, so keeping that in mind, does James White mean well when he's reading Romans 9 and he's trying to teach it to people? Yes, he does. When Paul Washer or John MacArthur or Sproul or any of these other Calvinistic friends of ours are preaching through these passages and they're teaching a Calvinistic soteriology, are they pushing the lamp over on purpose and getting it wrong on purpose? No, they are stumbling. They're making a mistake. They're free. They have free will. This is how we explain their error. We say they have free will and they're fleshly and they see through the glass dimly and they're making a mistake. Calvinists are on a weak footing here, because when we as Arminians or Provisionist or non-Calvinists preach, we're making a mistake ultimately because God decreed for us to do it, because all things are in accordance with God's decree if what they believe is true. So my mistake, if Calvinism is true, my mistake is decreed by God. My interpretive errors are decreed by God. My misunderstanding of some text are decreed by God, and I could not do otherwise. God has withheld whatever measure of grace I need to discern these things. That to me is detrimental to the entire Calvinistic worldview, because ultimately it puts back onto God the responsibility that he gives to us, which is to properly discern the Scriptures. And the reason that some people don't properly discern the Scriptures, you mentioned Joel Osteen, for example, and I think Joel Osteen's probably a well-intending guy as well, but he's known to be more of a health, wealth, prosperity type of preacher, and tends to read passages very surfacey and proof texting. I think we could argue that point, or I think you and I would agree on that, but some people might argue that point. But nevertheless, if Calvinism is true, God has decreed for the pastor of the largest church in the United States to proof text Scripture and to teach heretical or false doctrines. I don't believe that. I believe Joel Osteen is making mistakes. I believe he's free, and I believe he's making mistakes because of the responsibility that he's been given, and he's free to make those mistakes, and he's responsible for those mistakes. Not just that he's held a culpable for them, even though he has no control over it, but that he's actually able to respond. He's able to exegete the text properly. He's able to understand truth rightly and to preach truth rightly. And when he doesn't do so, it's his fault and his fault alone. I can't resort back to, well, that's what God sovereignly decreed in his secret will to happen. And I think that is detrimental to the entire Calvinistic system. Would you agree?
I agree. It definitely raises a lot of issues. It creates a mess, and it, yeah. So,
yep.
And like I said in the debate, I've been accused of being emotionally. This is an emotional response to Calvinism, and it's not. The reason I'm against Calvinism before I even got into Romans 9 is because of what the Bible says, the way it describes God, the way it describes his self-sacrificial nature, just the things he commands us to do. And the reason I'm against Calvinism is well before I read came to this understanding of Romans 9. It's because of the biblical witness as a whole. It doesn't sound like the God of the Bible. Maybe there's some pockets that are debatable, like what we're talking about today, Romans 9 or Ephesians 1. But if you take a step back and look at the whole biblical witness, there's just too many contradictions with Calvinism, and that's why. And so I think what's on the table is like, who is this God we serve? And we can't be like Job's friends. We if there's a veil of ignorance over us, we got to be careful of what we're talking about, the way we speak about God. Job's friends were ignorant. They had no idea what God was doing behind the scenes, and they made all these presumptions, and they presumed what God was doing and ended up being in the wrong by that. And so in this case of soteriology, one of the reasons I haven't really committed to a system yet is because I'm trying to be careful not to say things that aren't true about God. You know what I mean? And I think we need to be careful in these regards, especially if the biblical witness pulls in so many different directions. We need to be very careful not presuming upon this God we serve, and not be dogmatic about it, especially not beat up other brothers and sisters over it. Right. So. Well,
I think the point you make about emotion, I hear that sometimes too, is that you're just rejecting Calvinism because of emotional appeal, and I'll concede there are some people who do reject Calvinism on purely emotional. I'm not one of them, because I know myself. I know that you don't walk away from a system you held to for 10 years because of emotions. And I'm not a very emotional person when it comes to those kinds of things. If this is what God says and it's difficult, then I'll swallow it. I'll accept it, even if it's difficult for my emotions. But something that strikes me as interesting about that claim is that on Calvinism, your emotions are just as much ordained by God as your mind is and your reason is. And so what makes some people respond emotionally towards difficult things in the text? If not, well, that's the way God decreed for them to respond. And the fact that God has given us both a mind and a heart. He's given us emotions and will. He's given us the ability to deliberate as well as to feel. And this is part of the balance, I think, that God has created even within humanity between male and female. I know my wife is almost the complete opposite of me emotionally, and in a lot of other ways as well, just how we do budgeting and how we do family planning and how we do parenting. We're just different. And what used to be a thorn in my flesh early in my marriage when it came to those differences has become something that I have really grown to appreciate, because she balances my rough edges and she provides a balance to me. Well, God has provided a balance within man of both the heart and the mind. And I don't think it is all coincidental that most women, I'm not saying all, there's a lot of women who are Calvinist, obviously, but usually when people are contacting my show and having issues, a lot more within their marriage and those kinds of things, it's a lot more the women who are fighting against and pushing back against Calvinism. And you may say, well, that's because they're more emotional centered and they're more thinking about the heart, and they're more thinking about the fact that their babies may not be elect, like the show we just released yesterday, where the lady, a grandmother named Grace, called in about, why do I pray for my children, my grandchildren, if God may not have chosen them? And the Calvinistic host pretty much quotes Romans 9 and says, you're not to question God on that. You're just to do what he says, do what he commands, and he says to pray for the lost, so you're supposed to pray for them. And if it doesn't seem to compute with you, then just appeal to mystery and keep praying. And I just push back on that to say, I think God has created us with both the mind and the heart. And so when those emotions and that welling up within you says something is wrong here, something's not sitting right with me, like that lady testified to when she just said, I just couldn't sleep at night. And when this hit me, it just, why am I praying for them if God could have chosen them for destruction and damnation for his glory? How does that work? How do I worship a God who's doing that? That emotional welling up, maybe that shouldn't be a reason you necessarily exegete a text one way or another. But again, it goes back to the weight thing you were talking about. What sets right with the Spirit within you? What do you call good? When you call God good, what does that mean? Is it recognizably good, or do you just say, well, God's good because I know I'm supposed to say he's good, and I can't possibly say he's bad, even though it sounds like what you just described him doing as being pure evil, but I'm going to still call him good, while at the same time saying he's doing something that seems very, very unjust, i.e. condemning people for reasons beyond their control. Those kinds of things just don't sit well with our spirit and our heart, even as believers, regenerate believers. So could it be that there's something wrong with that interpretation, especially given the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds of years of alternative interpretations prior to Augustine and even following Augustine who did not hold to that view and that comport with the rest of the scriptures in a very clear way that doesn't require Paul to eisegete Old Testament text? Why not consider some of these other interpretations more objectively? And when I was a Calvinist, I'll be honest, I didn't feel like I had to do much debating. It seems like the only people I was facing when I was debating against Arminians were people saying things. Well, John 3:16. Well, why would I even evangelize then? And that was like the only arguments I was being given. I had nobody coming to me and saying, have you sat down with the exegetical commentary of some of these other scholars to see how they might be interpreting Romans 9? I didn't have anybody doing that. I had people going, oh, John 3:16, whosoever, whosoever, whosoever. And they would just repeat whosoever a bunch of times. And I'm like, yeah, but are you going to read Romans 9? Well, yeah, it doesn't mean what you think it means. I don't know what it means, but it doesn't mean that. Okay, that's not an argument. I'm sorry, but I'm going to stay a Calvinist if that's the best you can bring me.
That was pretty much me in the beginning.
That's just.
I didn't know how to answer.
Yeah, you don't know how to answer, and so you're just going, okay, well, yeah.
You know, it doesn't sit right with what you read in the Bible, but you don't know how to answer the proof text.
Right. Yeah.
So you can't really.
You can get bogged down.
Here's the thing, and you kind of just mentioned it. It's like what? Let me just pose a hypothetical. You hear a lot of, and this see this with atheists. When sometimes people become an atheist, it's this huge gulf. They come to find out, I believe this is true, either atheism or Calvinism, and they struggle with it. It's a fight. They don't want it to be true, but then there's this phase of they have to accept it. Then they kind of get through the other side. What happens if you didn't even have to do that? What happens if Calvinism is just not even true at all, and you kind of sacrificed all this just headspace for this, and you kind of put certain things to the side, your intuitions, even your understanding of the Bible, and you didn't even have to. What happens if God really isn't deterministic like that? What happens if God really loves all of mankind and provides for all of them to know His Son, and you just kind of did all this for nothing? It's something to consider. Another thing that kind of after this whole Romans 9 thing, let's say this real quick, is kind of like just seeing, like, I honestly believe this interpretation of Romans 9 is the correct one. I know that may sound arrogant, but honestly, it sits better with me. It sits better with the biblical witness. It makes better sense of everything Paul is saying. It makes sense of before even Paul writes Romans. But it makes me wonder, like, if Calvinists can get this so wrong, to me, and again, that sounds arrogant to a Calvinist listener. To me, it's like, if they can get this wrong, it makes me wonder what else they may have gotten wrong too. You know what I mean? Right. Because the way I see it now is like, wow. And so,
yeah, and I've heard that testimony quite a bit. Matter of fact, one of the guys we had on our program said, once I realized the L of limited atonement, even Calvin arguably didn't hold to the types of Owen and people who know the debates over limited atonement know what I'm talking about, when Owen's commercialism view is more popularized by Piper today. But it's not been the predominant view among Reformed theologians, as indicated in Allen's book, through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of quotes throughout Reformed history. But once you realize how wrong modern-day Calvinists have gotten the L, then it makes you go, okay, well, maybe they got the U wrong, which is what you were really hammering on with unconditional election of individuals to effectual being the I, irresistible grace. And so if they got the L wrong, maybe, just maybe, they've gotten the U and the I wrong. And maybe we should examine that. And of course, the big one that I always focus on is the T of total depravity, which is interpreted as inability from birth. Could it be that maybe we still have the ability to respond to God in His truth? That maybe Adam and Eve didn't lose the ability to respond to God when He speaks to us through His truth. And we're actually held responsible because, silly us, maybe we actually believe we're able to respond to the things that He tells us He wants us to do, like repent and trust in Jesus for salvation, because you can't save yourself through works. But tell me if this logic holds water. If you can reject theistic determinism, you should. Because if theistic determinism is true, then God will ultimately decide whether you will accept theistic determinism or not. In other words, you can't freely choose to be deterministic. You can't freely choose to accept theistic determinism. If theistic determinism is true, then God will theistically determine for you to accept theistic determinism. So the safest place for you to be is to consciously and willingly reject theistic determinism, because if God wants you to accept it, He'll cause you to. He'll determine for you to. Is there anything logically wrong with that? I mean, I know it's just purely a philosophical argument, but it seems to hold water to me.
Yeah. Such a conundrum, man.
It's like the meme that says choose determinism. It's like, that's an oxymoron. Choose determinism. Libertarianly, freely choose determinism. And people fighting so hard to get you to choose their systematic way of thinking, when all the while they think it's God ultimately the one who's going to decide what you will follow, and what doctrinal system you'll fall into is up to God anyway. So it becomes quite comical when you see that kind of unfold. But nevertheless, God bless you, my friend. Thank you for spending the time with us this afternoon and just kind of walking through these texts. And we'll just challenge the folks in the listening audience to go back to Romans 9 and read it again in fresh and new, and maybe allow the Holy Spirit to speak through both your mind and your heart. and help you to understand better what even Peter described as being hard to understand, and that we will seek to understand God's truth and His provision for every man, woman, boy, and girl. God bless you. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending our online university classroom. Remember, this is a listener-supported ministry, so please consider becoming a patron of the podcast by donating online. Join our team and help spread the word. For more resources, books, and articles from Professor Flowers, or to learn how you can support this ministry, please visit www.soteriology101.com.